One of the oldest pieces of wisdom literature in the world is a piece of philosophy that is written in poetry. It's the central portion of the Hebrew Bible's book of Job. And I say the central portion because, like a lot of ancient texts, it's gone through a lot of editing over the centuries with very inferior minds trying to force Job to make more sense in a traditional religious context by giving it a historical context and then several different endings that actually kind of make the whole thing seem more ridiculous. So ignore the first two chapters that tell a truly blasphemous story about basically a gambling agreement between Satan and God, and the multiple added endings of the book that offer absurd fixes to the discomfort created by the original work. You know, if all of your children are killed in an accident, getting more children doesn't really make that okay. But the original work asks this persistent, time-honored question: why is there undeserved suffering in the universe? And then the book answers that profound question 40 chapters later, saying that there is no reason. It just is. A lot of people try to take the sting out of suffering by insisting that somehow it is God's will, that God has a plan. I don't think this is ever really very helpful, but those of us with a more panentheistic worldview accept that God is not a person who makes plans or who has a specific will. God doesn't prefer baseball over hockey or fried chicken over sushi. The universe itself is God, and in case you haven't noticed, the universe can be quite capricious. Sure, the universe follows certain laws of physics. We call them laws. They're just the way things work. But there's so much in the universe, so many, literally infinite number of variables, that it is experienced as being capricious. But we assure ourselves that the universe, while capricious, is never malicious. This is important to understand. The universe can seem to be very random, but assigning intent to the university, like you are being specifically blessed or cursed, is a very primitive anthropomorphizing of the universe, which is, I'm afraid to say, almost certainly not at all true. The universe has no malice of intent, but it also has no benevolence. It simply is. So meaning, direction, purpose, those are human inventions. And I insist they are also a human responsibility. We bring structure to the chaos by our intent, our decisions, our plans. If there is meaning to be found in life, it will be because we have created it. The universe isn't malicious, but folks, people are malicious. People can be horribly malicious. The universe just rocks on its merry way, but sometimes it'll just drop some good fortune into the paths of unsuspecting persons. But it also drops diseases and heartbreak in others without rhyme or reason. The universe does not seek to bless you or to curse you. That is all up to your interpretation. However, as is true in most religious trivialities, there is a kernel of truth in saying that everything happens for a reason. It just isn't a divine reason. A lot of suffering comes your way for the simple reason that you have made horrible and irresponsible decisions. Job's suffering is portrayed as being suffering of the capricious sort. His three friends who come to console him, but also to correct him in defense of God, as if a God ever needed defending, insists that everything happens for a reason, that God has a plan, that Job has either done something to offend God and God is punishing him, or God has a bigger plan and is teaching Job an important lesson. But in the end, Job insists that they are all mistaken. His misfortunes, the loss of his fortune, the death of his family members, his own painful illness, these were capricious occurrences of nature, neither divine retribution for bad conduct or to teach him some kind of larger theological awareness. The plain truth of it is that some suffering just is. It just happens. For many years, the longest-running show on Broadway was a kind of modern recasting of Job in the person of Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof. Tevye has these brilliant and witty conversations with God. Of course, God doesn't say anything. God remains silent. But Tevye speaks to God in this very familiar conversational way about how unfair it is to have been born a poor Jew at the turn of the century in Russia when the Russian displacement of Jews was just beginning. The play opens with Tevye forced to pull his own ox cart when his horse has gone lame as he sells milk and cheese in the final hours of sunlight before Sabbath begins. He pauses and says to God, "Isn't it enough that you give me a life of poverty and bless me with 5 daughters and no sons? But what do you have against my horse? Why does the horse has to go lame just before Sabbath?" A lot of Tevye's suffering is certainly the result of his context. He was born Jewish in a rural part of Russia that would soon be turning against Jewish people. He lived in fairly pre-modern circumstances that left him working very hard but never able to work his way out of poverty. By pure chance, his wife gives birth to only daughters, giving him no sons with whom to share the labor that kept his family alive. But we see him suffering from his willingness to adhere to traditions that he sings about and dances, saying that it's the traditions that make life make sense, that hold life together, even though many of those traditions no longer make sense in his generation. Arranged marriages, Jewish conformity to a crushing economic system that makes a tailor poor and a butcher wealthy, and even accepting racial prejudice against one of his own daughters when she marries a Russian Orthodox man. Most of what broke Tevye's heart was his own unquestioning willingness to be victimized by a set of beliefs that unnecessarily made his life hard and broke his heart in such painful ways. I had to watch my own parents struggle to very unsuccessfully pretend to accept their 8th grandchild, who was my daughter, who we adopted from South Korea. The idea was as much of an affront to them as some of Tevye's daughter's choices in marriage. And like Tevye, my parents had no real reason to suffer over my daughter's brown skin and almond-shaped eyes. In fact, they largely missed out on having a relationship with the smartest, the most attractive, the funniest, and the most successful of all of their grandchildren. And I say that objectively. I can back it up with evidence if need be. Their racial prejudice, sure, it was a part of their generation, particularly their generation in rural Kentucky, but most of their peers had gotten over those prejudices years before. They kept their prejudice by choice. And the ones who suffered the most from their choice was them. As the Buddha said, the fire you kindle against your enemy burns you. Because folks, sometimes suffering just finds us And yet sometimes we consciously or unconsciously choose it for ourselves when there are much better options right in front of us. If you've never read Man's Search for Meaning, I encourage you to stop what you're doing and go read it. It was written by the Holocaust survivor and founder of logotherapy, Viktor Frankl, who advocated for Americans to balance the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast with a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast. Because he argued simply having liberty, being liberated, doesn't equate to a life that is really lived in freedom. This proposed monument, the artist mock-up of the one you see in this illustration, it's one arm and a hand reaching down and grasping another hand and arm. I'm glad Frankl didn't live to see that one. I'm afraid the artist kind of missed the point on that. But still, some kind of Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast, I think, would be a great idea. Søren Kierkegaard said something similar a century before Frankl said about this Statue of Responsibility. Kierkegaard wrote, "People clamor for freedom of speech while avoiding freedom of thought. We are at liberty to say whatever we want within the confines of the obvious limitations of don't shout fire in a crowded theater. But social media in all of its forms allows us to spew unfiltered opinions, conspiracy theories, prejudices, and absolutely embarrassing nonsense at will. But somehow it never seems to educate, to persuade, or to satisfy our need to be free, does it? I certainly understand that a lot of the social progress we've made in the past generation has come from very intentional decisions to be compassionate about the innocent suffering of other people, to understand that no one chooses the race that they're born into, and most people have no choice in what their sexual orientation is. No one who becomes an addict or an alcoholic set out to become an addict or an alcoholic. Mental health struggles, people locked into cycles of poverty, especially people who have been marginalized by nation of origin or language or religion. These are unfair limitations that are placed on people's shoulders that causes a tremendous amount of suffering. And our sensitivity to that through education, travel, experience, that's a good thing. But we have, I think, often failed to do the hard work of allowing ourselves to examine how we have participated in the times and ways in which we have felt that we were being victimized. Eleanor Roosevelt was perhaps giving herself some license to exaggerate when she said that no one can make you feel inferior without your consent. That's at least the way she was popularly quoted. One of my counseling professors took her exaggeration and carried it a half-mile farther down the field and told us in class, no one can really hurt you unless you help them. Now that's an obvious exaggeration, but I think that Liston Mills used to say things like that in class to shock us into deeper self-evaluation. If you choose not to feel inferior when someone is talking down to you, it's surprising how often you can resist the manipulation of those feelings of inferiority. When someone is trying to humiliate you, trying to make you angry, to insult you, choosing to not reward your tormentor with their desired reaction, that can short-circuit the whole exchange. What Frankl learned while living in a Nazi death camp was that while they could take away your family, they could take away your job, your house, your papers, your life's research, they could even take away your clothes and your shoes, but they could not take away from you your ability to choose how you would react to their torture. Those who gave in and were broken typically died quickly. Those who resisted, who maintained a sense of their own dignity and their worth despite their circumstances, were often the ones that survived until the day they were set free. Certainly, they could not physically fight back against the Nazis, but they could refuse to accept the way the Nazis viewed and treated the Jews. I've often talked with people who felt that they had been terribly abused in religion. One young mother who was a nurse limped into my office one day with bruises on her face and neck and arms. She reported having cracked ribs and an injured knee, and she was going to have to go to work at the hospital and tell her supervisors that she had fallen down a flight of stairs, an explanation that she had already used once that year. She was in a violently abusive marriage, a marriage for which she had broken her vows in a convent, leaving behind her nun's habit to marry and to have children. Her priest told her, scolding her, that this abuse was her cross to bear for having broken her vow to God to be a celibate nun, a vow she had made when she was 18 years old, that she was supposed to keep until she died. As I said in each of our counseling sessions, it was not only her husband who was killing her, it was also the Roman Catholic Church, and she needed to leave them both. But she could not leave her husband, she said, because she could not imagine leaving her church. So was she a victim? Sure, absolutely she was. But, and this is hard for me to say, but if you ask herself if she was enabling the victimization, you have to admit that she was. This is not to encourage victim blaming. The first criminal in this situation is the violent spouse, but close behind him, in my opinion, was the priest who continued to use religious guilt to trap her in a cycle of violence. Now, I knew this priest very well. He was elderly and poorly educated, but he simply never questioned the religious prejudices that he had inherited with his ordination into the priesthood of the Catholic Church. Now, most priests that I've known through the years, and I've known many, and monks as well, most of them had that crap figured out quickly, but this particular priest didn't choose to. But this nurse also didn't choose to leave the religion that had become so toxic in her life, binding her to a violent man and making her live out an extremely bad role model for her daughters. Now, you could go down the list of ways in which people are not simply victims, but they are literally co-conspirators in their abuse. I spoke at a suicide prevention conference a few years ago, and in the Q&A, it became apparent that many mothers in the room were deeply concerned about their young adult gay sons who were contemplating or threatening or who had even attempted suicide. But as the conversation continued in that conference, I learned that some of these mothers had actually taken their sons to gay conversion programs offered by their church, and many of them still took their sons every Sunday to churches that condemned them for being gay. They were literally putting the gun in their sons' hands while in their own hearts were living in fear that their sons might choose to kill themselves. As Kierkegaard lamented, they may be exercising freedom of choice, but they are not embracing any freedom of thought. They could escape a toxic religion that might push their sons to suicide, but they have to be willing to think their way out of the snare of the devil that they know. They have liberty, but they were not taking responsibility. They are free to make their own choices in life, but they have not taken the responsibility to make better choices. Redemption Song is one of the most famous songs recorded by the Jamaican artist Bob Marley. In it, he implores his people in Jamaica who have suffered oppression from colonists, their own government, and their religion, and a crushing economic system. Marley encourages them to emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. It's appropriate for those of us of a spiritual bent to try to understand people who have been unfairly victimized and to show them all the compassion we can muster, as well as joining them in taking direct action to lessen their suffering. But Bob Marley is right. None but ourselves can free our minds. And to the extent to which we have been trapped in mental slavery, making us co-conspirators in our own suffering, we need to take responsibility for thinking our way out of that prison. Strict obedience is not the only way to avoid religious guilt. You can turn your backs on toxic religion, and that's a better choice. Working hard, taking on 2 or 3 jobs, denying ourselves appropriate rest and reward is not the only way out of poverty. Sometimes we have to challenge the unfair economic system that creates poverty with all of its low wages and denial of health insurance and other job benefits. You don't have to stay in a toxic marriage or a toxic family or job or friendship. You don't even have to go back to your family Thanksgiving if you know you're going to have to face abuse. You can set boundaries that make sense for your own liberation. Your abusers always try to make you believe that you have no choice, but believe me, you do. Your government always tries to convince you that they have your best interests at heart, but even after 40 years of economic trickle-down propaganda, isn't it increasingly clear that our government is peeing on us, but telling us it's raining? We don't have to accept an economy that's been rigged to make the rich richer and to keep the poor in too much desperation to ever organize enough to change the system. Now, I'm going to have more to say about that in my next sermon, which will be posted on August 25th. But until then, please keep thinking your way out of mental slavery.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.